Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater this afternoon, and a special welcome to those who are joining us on YouTube. Today we're pleased to host historian Edward Baptist to talk about his new book, just released, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and Making of American Capitalism. Before we begin, I'd like to alert you to two upcoming programs. On Friday, in this very room at noon, Lynn Cheney will be here to talk about her new biography, James Madison, A Life Reconsidered. Although Madison was a modest, reserved man, he was the intellectual driving force behind the Constitution and was crucial to its ratification. A book signing will follow the program. And come back on Saturday the 13th at 2 o'clock to meet Little House on the Prairie star Melissa Gilbert. Her new book, My Prairie Cookbook, Memories and Frontier Food from My Little House to Yours, offers fans comforting family recipes as well as Gilbert's personal recollections and memorabilia from the Little House on the Prairie. A book signing will follow. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it by regular mail or email. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our education and outreach programs, and there are applications in the lobby. Edward Baptist's new book, The Half Has Never Been Told, delves into the economics of slavery in America before the Civil War. He shows us how the South's growing empire of cotton fueled industrialization and commerce, helping the United States grow into a modern capitalist economy. 10 years in the making, The Half Has Never Been Told puts enslaved African Americans at the center of the story. Baptist uses interviews with ex-slaves, personal narratives written by survivors who escaped slavery, the business papers and secret letters of enslavers, and the newspapers and public documents to tell the story of how American slavery grew, changed, and shaped the American nation. Edward Ayers, president of Richmond University and Bancroft-winning author, calls Baptist's work the fullest and most powerful account we have of the evolution of slavery in the United States from the Revolution to the Civil War. Baptist's account is eloquent, humane, passionate, and necessary. Ed Baptist grew up in Durham, North Carolina, got his undergraduate degree from Georgetown University, and did his graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania. Since 2003, he has taught at Cornell University, where he teaches about the history of slavery, the United States Civil War, American capitalism, and digital history. He's published Creating an Old South, Middle Florida's Plantation Frontier Before the Civil War, and with the late Stephanie Camp, New Studies in the History of American Slavery. He and Louis Hyman also just published a co-edited book called American Capitalism, a Reader, which is coming out this fall from Simon & Schuster. Ed is also leading a project called Freedom on the Move, a collaborative effort in digital history that's building a crowdsourced database of all fugitive slave ads. It's a personal pleasure to welcome Ed to the stage today. I first heard about this project in 2001 when I was the librarian at Duke University, where I had the pleasure of working with Ed's mother in the Duke libraries. Welcome, Ed Baptist, please.
All right, thanks. Thank you, David, and thank you to the National Archives for hosting this event, and perhaps most of all, thanks to all of you for coming here. And I really look forward to your questions. Those are often where I get the most out of these kind of events, and in fact, they pretty much always are. And I feel like I should say that you all are now in the presence of The Economist's favorite historian. For those of you who have seen that little dust up on social media, I can also answer questions about that. But what I really want to do is actually talk about the book and give you all an introduction to that. So let me jump into that. All right, well, my new book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, is the story of two bodies. The first body was the new kind of slavery that emerged in the young United States right after it achieved its independence from the British Empire. Although at the end of the American Revolution, slavery looked to some observers, including some enslaved people, as if it would disappear along with the new state's other colonial institutions. It did not. Instead, enslavers like Revolutionary War hero Wade Hampton of South Carolina transformed the institution of slavery. Once these innovators learned how to produce cotton with slave labor, cotton fiber became the most important commodity of the Industrial Revolution. As world demand for cotton grew manyfold after 1790, enslavers began to move enslaved African Americans south and west to the areas where you could grow cotton by the thousand. The victims of these forced migrations were people like Charles Ball, a young Maryland man sold to a slave trader in 1805. The trader, whom Ball eventually learned was named McGiffin, chained Ball to 51 other people and then marched them all 400 miles to South Carolina. That's where McGiffin sold Charles Ball to Wade Hampton. Divided by 400 miles of marching from his wife and children, Ball had also not seen his mother since her own sale to a slave trader 20 years earlier. And now Wade Hampton and his overseers would try to separate him from his very own self. Using work management techniques as ingenious as anything modern experts could imagine, except that these were backed up with brutal whippings and other kinds of torture, they forced Ball to reveal exactly how much work he could do if he went full speed from daybreak to dusk. And then the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and so on, they pushed him to work even faster, always with the threat of a bloody, horrifically painful, skin-shredding cowhide whipping hanging over his head. Over the next few decades, what happened to Charles Ball would happen again and again. By the time enslavers finished seizing millions of acres in the Mississippi Valley from the Indians and buying millions more from European empires like France, cheap cotton made ever more efficiently by enslaved African Americans was becoming the key raw material of an unprecedented transformation that we remember as the Industrial Revolution. Eventually, this massive economic change would raise millions and then billions of human beings' standards of living, moving them out of rural subsistence agriculture and into factory-focused work. While this change has challenging implications for the future of every species that lives on this planet, there's no question that the modernization of human societies and human economies has brought great benefits to many humans. But for Charles Ball, whose ever more efficient cotton labor was one of the foundations of this vast pyramid of transformation, and for millions of other human beings who, like him, were enslaved, it brought nothing but pain. And he was not alone. By 1860, enslavers like Hampton had moved over 1 million enslaved people, controlled over 80% of the world cotton market, and helped make possible a revolutionary factory system that changed forever how human economies worked. Now, when I did the research for this book, I attempted to be as comprehensive as possible. I visited dozens of archives, including the National Archives. I read through literally hundreds of collections of planter papers, tens of thousands of papers, in particular of their cotton records, their letters, as well as newspapers, and so on. All of these things we might call the enslaver's archive. But I also looked at what you could call the enslaved people's archives. And these were largely generated once they left slavery. So we have about 100 or so published autobiographies published during the 19th century, which were written by people who had been enslaved. And these are crucially important. And also important are the approximately 2,200 interviews that were done during the Great Depression by WPA workers, people who were working for the New Deal, of survivors of slavery. And there are a few other documents that I would put as part of the Enslaved People's Archive, or formerly Enslaved People's Archive. But I'd also draw your attention to one more thing that I was barely able to scratch the surface of, but which the archivist mentioned or perhaps alluded to a few minutes ago, which was the fugitive slave ads themselves. And that was something I was only able to begin to incorporate here in this particular project. But this project was complicated enough. Those thousands of different sources, tens of thousands of pages of records that talked about the lives of millions of people whose lives and whose acts then influenced tens and even hundreds of millions of other people as cotton became the most important commodity in the growing world economy, the increasingly interlinked global economy, of the 19th century, trying to figure out how to get a handle on that and shape it into a story, because I also wanted to tell a story that had a narrative thread to it, that moved the reader from point A in time to point B in time, from the Revolution to the Civil War, and explain to people how the grand drama of American politics, American economic growth, and the Civil War itself were part of, and were in part driven by, millions of stories like that of Charles Ball. Trying to figure out how to do that in one text was very difficult, and if you read the book, you can tell me whether or not I succeed or fail, perhaps. But let me explain a little bit about how I tried to shape this information into a story. So, as a writer and as a historian who was trying to get a handle on that massive unfree movement and its consequences, I was inspired, first of all, by the novelist Ralph Ellison. He described American history, and this is in an essay. This is not in his novel Invisible Man, which you probably have heard of, or perhaps have read. He described it as a vast drama being played out on the body of a Negro giant, to use his terms. He was writing in the 1950s. Ellison's metaphor seemed to describe the experiences of people like Charles Ball. Tied up like Gulliver, the body made up of all the enslaved bodies that were being bought and marched and exploited in the sources I was reading, the plantation ledgers, slave traders' journals, newspapers full of slave sale ads, and so on. These were all, I came to believe, they were all part of a giant metaphorical body. And this one was stretched across the new states and territories and across the decades of rapid American expansion. And everything that enslavers like Hampton tried to do was an attempt to turn enslaved people's bodies, enslaved African Americans' bodies, against their own interest. So they measured Charles Ball's cotton-picking rate and demanded more, until he had to race left hand against right hand and turn all the resources of his mind from sunup to sundown to the effort of trying to meet the quota they had set upon him, the effort of trying to survive one more day with an unstriped back. And as I wrote, I saw that you could dramatize the image of the economic and other relationships which enslavers were creating in some ways as the literal parts of that metaphorical body. So I named chapters after some of these metaphorical parts. Feet for the chapter that covers the development of the slave trade, which marched people south and west, their feet moving them against their wills, away from everything they'd known, everything that gave them strength and love. Right hand and left hand for the way that enslaved African Americans' creative abilities at work were extracted from and turned against them. Seed for the way that entrepreneurs figured out how to tap world cotton markets and world credit markets for the financing that allowed them to buy ever-growing armies of enslaved migrants, forced from Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas to the new states like Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi. And backs for the way that by the 1830s, this system, the great big interlinked and growing body of innovations and relationships, was building the wealth of Wade Hampton on the backs of enslaved people, and indeed the wealth not just of the cotton states, but of the other states as well. Still, it was true that whites in the cotton states were on average far wealthier than those in the rest of the United States, and the health of all Western countries' economies depended to no small extent on the price of cotton. But what about the second body? I mentioned that in a sense there were two bodies within this story. Well, this one is the body of African America itself, a culture and an identity formed in reaction to the creation of the body exploited by the corporate relationships created by enslavers and financiers and politicians and factory owners and consumers. What about that body? How should we think about that body? If we're thinking about the first one as a sort of Gulliver body that Ralph Ellison talked about, and a body that's exploited and turned against itself, what should we think in essence about what African Americans thought of themselves and their own relationships to each other? Well, Western culture has acquired over the last 200 years a couple of metaphorical ways to think about people whose bodies are controlled and forced to work against their own control and interests. And one of them is the zombie. Now, this word entered U.S. culture on a large scale when U.S. Marines occupied Haiti in 1915, and it has gone on to become a staple of horror film and literature. But the concept in Haiti, at any rate, in some ways is actually a commentary on the history of slavery from the perspective of the enslaved. And of course, Haiti emerged as an independent nation from the revolution, the slave revolution that overthrew slavery in French Saint-Domingue. And so this concept, too, is in a way, I'm going to explain how this works, in my opinion, is in a way a commentary on the history that precedes the revolution, what it was like to be enslaved in Saint-Domingue. Well, so here's the Haitian concept of voodoo, of zombies in practice, though. And you'll see what I mean. Supposedly, some Haitian Vodun practitioners can use spells and potions to kill a person and then raise them up as a will-less body that moves and acts, but which really isn't alive anymore. Now, this zombie story is really, as I said, a myth about slavery, a system in which powerful white wizards created rituals of social death, as the anthropologist Orlando Patterson described the ways that slaves were separated from their people and their own control over their own bodies. And likewise, we can see how forced migrants to the cotton frontier like Charles Ball, though they were already enslaved when they were bought by slave traders, were pushed through rituals of new levels, new kinds of social death, like separation from family, the process of sale. And we can see how they could feel that in the cotton fields they might be moving, but they were no longer truly alive. But there's a different metaphor. Let me back up a second and try to explain what some of the stakes of that are, that process of being moved and sold and ending up feeling like you're not truly alive. In a sense, in the 19th century, African America was in danger, potentially, of becoming a sort of vast zombie body, as it were, as cotton slavery expanded. And by the time that Charles Ball separated from the family and the hope for freedom and the pride in his own labor that had made even a life in Maryland slavery worthwhile, by the time he was toiling down one cotton row after another all day long, becoming the equivalent of a zombie for himself personally was a real possibility. And the people on the slave labor camp of Wade Hampton seemed to him to be moving towards that state as well. It was unclear whether they would be able to build relationships to each other, of friendship, of support, of religious fellowship, in some cases of marriage and love. It was unclear whether they would be able to bring out of themselves the will that's necessary to survive and to keep children alive. When he looked at their bodies, in fact, the first day that he was on the plantation, he was shocked at how bad they looked, at how unhealthy they looked. They were being driven so hard that they had no time to grow their own food, and so he wasn't sure if he was going to end up in that state as well, a state that was one of both the body and the mind. And so it wasn't just a fear for Charles Ball as an individual. It wasn't just a fear that individual slaves in general would end up in that state. There was also a possibility that an entire society would end up being destroyed, would end up being forced to walk in a sort of half-dead state in the service of its captors. As the power of enslavers grew, so too did their ability to render not just individuals, but a whole Gulliver body of African America dead in spirit, its components dead to one another, enslaved forever in a body that served their captors. But there's a different metaphor that could also describe the way that African Americans as individuals and in general experienced enslavers' new layers and new levels of exploitation in the 19th century. And I would argue this is the one that more accurately describes what actually happened. And that metaphor is the idea of the prisoner of war. When we see on video clips a shot-down pilot or a kidnapped journalist forced to mouth the ideological slogans of their captors, we don't think that the POW believes those words. In fact, we hear about prisoners of all nations, in all situations, who develop their own society, their own codes of communication, their own modes of resisting even when they cannot act. This creation and curation of alternative realities, acts of caring and respect to for each other, of hopes, hidden societies, systems of values that relentlessly oppose those of their captors, this is what keeps POWs from becoming zombies. And slavery, especially the intensified, entrepreneurial, constantly changing kind that developed in the 19th century U.S., This was, as the author Ta-Nehisi Coates puts it, a constant state of war, and so enslaved people were prisoners of war. And that's how they behaved, more often than they behaved like zombies. Though their collective body and individual bodies were stretched on the rack of brutal new systems of labor control, slave trading, and financialization, more of them refused to succumb to despair, far more than the number who simply gave up. In some slave societies, people gave up. In some slave societies, enslaved people did everything that they could to escape their collective identity, to turn against each other and to find themselves as separate and different from each other. But in this one, more people like Charles Ball chose to identify with each other. From disparate elements, they built a common language and a common set of cultural practices. They chose to identify with and care for each other. And part of this came from the fact that instead of assimilating the ideas and justifications of their oppressors, they created an account of history that named the very process that enslavers tried to use to divide them and exploit them, the forced migration to the high-profit entrepreneurial cotton frontier, as the deepest evil that they faced together, the thing that actually made them one. So if one body was a system of functions that extracted value from all enslaved people's bodies by subjecting them to a continual process of creations and destructions, the other body turned out to be that of African Americans as a people, a group that, though imprisoned, discovered their own sense of identity in the crucible of intensified exploitation and horrific violence. So the metaphorical bodies that this book talks about are not actual bodies, they're metaphorical bodies. So when you see the chapters and they say feet and right-handed, left-handed, and so on, those work as much as metaphors as descriptions of every single thing that happens in that chapter. But there are, of course, lots of real bodies in the book, and lots of them endure some pretty horrific treatment. But these two metaphorical bodies are at the spine of The Half Has Never Been Told, two bodies that grow and twine and fight each other, almost like Siamese twins trapped in the same womb. That's the story that develops over the course of the book's 420 pages. It's a long book until you think about what it's actually doing, which is recentering the history of the United States between the Revolution and the Civil War, around this one historical process in two bodies. Let me break briefly to tell a little story that I learned here in the National Archives. And this comes from the records of Union veterans' pensions. And there are perhaps 100,000 African-American Union veterans, give or take a few, who either applied for pensions after the Civil War or family members applied for pensions. And this process required them to write what were essentially autobiographies and get people to testify to the truth or the falsehood of these autobiographies. And then somebody in Washington would decide whether or not that person was worthy of a pension. And so the files that accumulate over time tell the story not just of individuals, but what their community thinks of their story, and what their community, their neighbors, their friends know about that story. And one that I chose to include near the end of the book is the story of Cade and Liza McCallum. Cade McCallum was the veteran, Liza was his widow. And as I walk the reader through the story or through what we know of it, what we see is two more people who, again, like Charles Ball, were separated from the people who they knew. In the case of Cade McCallum, he's brought from Virginia or perhaps from North Carolina, or perhaps from Maryland. His wife is never quite straight on where he came from because they met long after the war. But he went through that, and Liza McCallum went through that process as well. She was moved from Missouri, where she was born, down into Louisiana, and he was moved from the southeast to Louisiana. But they're both working in slavery when the Civil War comes. And when the Civil War comes and the Union Army enters Louisiana, what they both do, they take two different paths. Cade McCallum literally swims part of the Mississippi River, hanging on to the edge of a rowboat till he finds a Union gunboat. Liza goes and works for the Union Army in a refugee camp. But what they do is they move and they change and they take advantage of the situation that has emerged. And they act in order, in their own individual ways, to bring the system that had oppressed them, the system that had done so much to damage their lives and to move their bodies around and to exploit their bodies. They do things to change that. And though their lives continued to be difficult in certain ways after the Civil War, they also had things that they would not have had after the Civil War. The ability to move, the ability to find, to choose and find to some extent the kind of work that they would do, the ability to get married to each other and know that they would be able to remain married if they both so chose to each other for as long as they lived, and the ability to raise their children and know that their children would not be sold away from them. These were not small things. These were not small victories for them to achieve. And they were able to do things like that, in part because of the efforts, not just their own efforts in escaping to Union lines, and in Cade's case, actually fighting for the Union Army, but because of efforts that had begun a long time before, because of the things that Charles Ball did on the plantation where he found himself, to build relationships to other people, to simply survive one day after another, and then to tell his story, because the stories that escaped slaves tell become crucially important to the development of the abolitionist movement that helps to bring on the Civil War. So the struggle to survive in individual bodies and to survive as a whole collective body that in fact had to be built, a sort of giant POW camp stretched across the South. That struggle to survive was crucially important to being able to bring about the Civil War, bring about Union victory in the Civil War, and bring about the end to slavery. So, as we see in 2014, of course, many struggles continue, many struggles for African Americans and for other people around the world. But I'd like to hope that in a very small way, when people read the book, although there are certainly some horrific stories in there, I hope they'll also see that it's a story of survival. And in that sense, while we might not see survival as a kind of redemption, in those circumstances it truly was, and it truly brought about historical change. All right, I'll stop there, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you.
Sir, you need to go to the microphone.
Well, thank you very much. It's a superb production. I'm looking at the upstream, the impact of white Christianity on Africa from 1500 onwards. And so you had, from then on for 400 years, a massive transfer of capital from Africa into the Americas. And you also had, therefore, the destruction of economics of Africa because the famines are destroyed. And civil society, social fabric, were destroyed. And we're living by the consequences of that. Now, I wonder if you can give me some information on that section of historic society.
On the consequences of the Middle Passage?
Yes.
On Africa?
Yes.
Okay. So that's not really the focus of the book.
I understand. I want some information there.
Sure. Well, the Atlantic slave trade is a massive human movement that precedes internal movements in the Americas, and clearly it has a massive impact on Africa. But I think I'm going to kind of dodge that question a little bit because there are Africanists who can speak to that a lot more clearly than me. What I will say, and maybe this will be more useful, is that the expansion. While I'm not in a position to quantify the nature of the impact on Africa over time, and to some extent it's always going to be speculative. What happens in the 19th century in the U.S. with the expansion of cotton production is part of the process that creates the Industrial Revolution, as I said, and transforms human economies. But there are other processes like that that are happening in the Atlantic Basin, so in the Americas, in Africa, and in Europe, that are linked to the impact of the cotton expansion. The cotton expansion and the demand of the world for cotton textiles is what helps to pull 1 million people out of their homes in Maryland and Virginia and the Carolinas and into an intensified kind of slavery in Mississippi and so on. But you can also say that same upsurge in consumer demand, that same upsurge in industrial production also leads to a tremendous intensification of sugar production in Cuba, coffee production in Brazil, where some somewhat similar processes happen that also involve ultimately millions of enslaved people. And even on the African coast, where there are forms of slavery in some areas that existed in a sort of traditional society, in the 19th century, sometimes with the direct intervention of Europeans and sometimes without their direct intervention, what you see is an increase in plantation-style production right along the coast for products, or production of products, for instance, palm oil is one of them, that are crucially important to the Industrial Revolution. So not only does the industrialization of Europe pull still more people out of Africa very violently to places like Brazil and Cuba and before 1807 the U.S., but even in Africa, it's remaking the economy during the 19th century and leading to intensified, expanded slavery there. So I don't know if that gets to what you're talking about. Yeah.
I've read that Lincoln thought that he could end slavery short of war by containing it, keeping it from expanding into the new states, the new territories, and that he thought that way it would die out within a couple of generations. And apparently, I've also read that a lot of Southerners had the same concerns, and that's why they split the Democratic Party in the election of 1860 and nominated somebody who, would not even deal, work with Lincoln, and that I'm just wondering whether you think that Lincoln was right and whether those Southerners who were afraid of that, as you said, I think apparently that a lot of the Southerners not only wanted to expand west, but into Cuba and Mexico. Yeah. Whether you think Lincoln was right and those Southerners who were right, who opposed him and who started the Civil War as a result, if you could just speak to that.
Yeah. So what number, does anybody remember what number President Lincoln was? I always have to count this on my hands. And
16.
Yeah, so 15 presidents before Lincoln had presided over some form of slavery territorial expansion, either processes that were, concluded, acquisitions that were concluded in their term in office, or processes that were underway. And in fact, when Lincoln proposes gradual emancipation early on to the governors of some border states, he was taking an act that was more radical against slavery than just about any other act any president had made before, or all of them combined, right? So, I think sometimes we understate the radicalism of Lincoln, but I think what your question is exactly right about, and right on point about is the fact that Lincoln believed that closing off expansion would end slavery within a few generations, and many Southerners did as well. But I think the reasons were a little bit different. So Lincoln had bought into a set of ideas that many Northern Republicans and their political predecessors had started to believe after the economic depressions of 1837 and 39, which was that slavery was inherently inefficient as a system, and that it was something that had a sort of a clock ticking on it, that it was going to eventually come to an end, and it could only survive by moving west and getting fresh land. But slave owners believed that slavery could only survive by moving west, because only by doing that could they create new opportunities for Southern whites. And only if they could create new opportunities for Southern whites, and expansion did that in a couple of ways, which I can describe in just a second, but only if they offered these new opportunities would Southern whites who were either not fully part of the slave economy, in other words, they didn't own slaves themselves, they didn't work for a slave owner, or even those who were sort of at the bottom tier of the slave economy, only then would they be fully committed to supporting a system where some Southern whites were extremely wealthy, much wealthier than the majority of non-slaveholders. So slaveholders knew that they had to keep offering these kinds of opportunities because whenever they acquired a new territory, three things happened. The first of all was that there was more land and more opportunity to create new economic enterprises, especially slave labor camps. The second thing was that those territories and all of their counties and towns and so on created wonderful opportunities for people to make new careers, whether it's politicians, newspaper publishers. Every little village had 3 or 4 newspapers until the editors started to shoot each other in duels. This happened quite a lot. All of these kinds of opportunities, and more than that, business opportunities as merchants and so on, these gave the chance for non-slave owners to say, I'm a pretty smart guy, I can move out there and find my way into the planter class that way. It made the planter class look open. And then finally, and most important of all, new territory had this amazing effect on European investors. They sent money there, and they sent money there in great big gobs and buckets. Millions of dollars every year were transferred from European savers to Southern borrowers in a sort of continuous stream. And that, I think, is why Southern slaveholders didn't want to see a closing off of the frontier. Not because there was any sort of inherent economic inefficiency. It was certainly more efficient than sharecropper cotton production after the Civil War. It was a lot harder than for the people who actually did the work. But yeah. So I think they agreed on that point, Lincoln and the slaveholders.
Were they right?
Were they right? No, I think Lincoln was wrong. I think Lincoln was wrong because forced labor has, I would argue, played a much bigger part in our global economy since 1865 than any of us would particularly care to admit. Even to this day, people are picking cotton in conditions of unfreedom. In Uzbekistan, for instance, that's certainly one allegation that we hear quite frequently. And we know that there are other kinds of slavery and other kinds of forced labor around the world. And in the right sort of political situation, with the right kinds of protections for enslavers and lack of protection for enslaved people, the level of exploitation can still be enough to make slave ownership a economically efficient proposition.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for the framework and the metaphors really brings a thoughtfulness to this part of American history and helps us, I think, frame my question, which is about how do we take our history and inform our present, basically. We still have, as we all know in this room, an incredible inability to understand how the experience of slavery is informing everything that happens from our schools to Ferguson to whatever. I'm interested, particularly since you mentioned the Coates essay, what you think about informing the question of reparations and what reparations would actually mean in terms of now, both economically and, sort of philosophically, and based on, Robinson's book on the debt and so forth. How can this piece of history help to inform present day so we can still come to terms with the racial divide and become racial allies?
Okay, well, I know my answer isn't going to really change this situation, but let me try to give a little bit of food for thought, maybe. perhaps. So I think there's three things to think about here. The first one, it comes from the work of a historian named Ken Pomerantz, who's now at the University of Chicago. And he looked at the question of why, in the end, we had, why industrialization happened first in Great Britain and more broadly in the Western European world, including the United States. And this is a question a lot of people have looked at, and they've given a lot of explanations, as you can imagine. But what he saw was that in at least according to his story, and I think there's some persuasiveness to it, in pre-industrial economies, sometimes you had societies that were going through some pretty rapid economic development all the same. Like, for instance, northern China in the 17th and 18th centuries. That's where his own work started, where he's most deeply rooted as a scholar. But at a certain point, those societies would go through would enter what he called a resource cul-de-sac. So without advanced methods of production that are highly, highly efficient, ultimately the society, if it dedicated enough of its labor force and enough of its resources in general towards the production of anything other than fuel and food, like, for instance, the fiber that would be necessary to create a major textile industry, then those societies started to crumble. Ultimately, with pre-modern modes of transportation and pre-modern kinds of energy use and so on and so forth, they simply couldn't leap into the next level of orbit, if you will, or out of the sort of gravity well of traditional agricultural economies. It only happened once, and that was, of course, the one that took off between 1750 and 1850 in the West. And those societies had access to massive quantities of commodities that came from outside the core areas that ultimately industrialized. And in particular, what's really important is cotton from the American South. Cotton from the American South, which becomes the main fiber that is used in the Industrial Revolution. And he did a little thought experiment. He said, all right, let's say that Britain did not have access to the American South's cotton, which, because of the kinds of labor management that were being inflicted on people like Charles Ball, was being produced more and more efficiently in the fields every single year. Let's say they didn't have access to that. In 1830, sort of in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, would Britain itself have been able to produce enough fiber? Well, you can't grow cotton in Britain. So it wouldn't have been cotton, and that would have been a problem too for reasons that we could talk about. But let's say even if you did it with wool, it's harder to invent the right kind of machines for wool, but eventually that was done. Let's say you did it with wool. In order to produce the same amount of fiber that was being brought from the southern U.S. states to Britain in 1830, you would have to turn every single acre on the island of Britain into a sheep pasture. All right? There would be no towns. There would be no London. There would be no coal mines. There would not even be room for factories, much less for fields that would produce even more food. So what I'm saying is when we think about reparations, when we think about the impact of slavery on the history of our economy, the economy we all share throughout the world, in fact, but which has been particularly productive and successful here in the U.S., when you think about that, you have to think not just about the quantity of the contribution, but how the contribution and how the institution of slavery may have helped us to get to a completely different kind of life and a completely different kind of economy from what we would have been in otherwise. I'll skip the second one, which is an anecdote, and I can come back to it later if necessary. But let me get to the third point. What would reparations look like? There's a lot of discussion about this, and I'm not saying any ideas are right, any ideas are wrong, but I do think that part of the discussion should be two groups, two kinds of African American institutions that were systematically starved in certain ways after emancipation, but which are crucially important in the history of African America and which also have a lot to give to all of the United States. And one is black farmers who have been systematically, up until the very recent past, denied access to the same kind of USDA support, and also have been, I think the only word is oppressed by local governments on a large scale. And the other group is HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, which were created by and sustained by primarily African American communities. And you might say, well, why should, let's say, federal money be diverted to a small HBCU when it could go to Harvard, right? Nothing against Harvard, but first of all, Harvard already has a lot of money, right? It's not clear that giving money to Harvard is going to make the same kind of marginal impact that it would if you gave it to an institution in my hometown, North Carolina Central, which is a fantastic institution in a lot of ways, but could use a lot more money. And then people might say, well, there's not enough expertise there. If you put money there, experts will go there, black, white, whatever. So I think, whether the discussion leads to reparations or whether the discussion doesn't, I think that thinking about black farmers and HBCUs should definitely be part of the discussion from my perspective anyway.
Yes, a couple of questions. You mentioned earlier that there, and it sort of piqued my interest, you mentioned there was about 100,000 former black Civil War veterans actually applied for pension. Okay, so I was doing the math in my head. There were about 180,000 blacks that served in the Army, about roughly 20,000 in the Navy. Depending on who do you believe, about 30,000 were killed in combat. Mm-hmm. What happened to the other 50,000?
That's a ballpark guess. 100,000. I made the guess on purposely to be on the low end, but you all may know much better than me. How many files are from USCT veterans and. Yeah, don't mean to put you on the spot, but that's a ballpark, keeping it purposefully low.
Because I think it's fairly conservative.
Yeah.
Those are only the ones who applied for pension.
Yeah, so not everybody applied for pension. Not everybody had survivors who applied for pension. Yeah.
Right, but given the institutional barriers you had, I guess the interesting question, and obviously this is outside the scope of your discussion, is the number that actually received pension once they applied. Because there were, for example, you read Richard Wright's native son, his grandfather tried many times and didn't get it because he was in Mississippi. The final question I have is this. You said something that was interesting. When Jackson defeated the Creeks and the Indians, Native Americans, primarily in Mississippi and Alabama, and defeated the English during the 1812 in New Orleans, it opened up a broad frontier of land. So based on what you had mentioned, that business model where you indicated that the expansion, particularly to the west, was also included notions of providing for whites who were not members of the planter class, and it also opened up the door for additional investments from Europeans. So was that expansion of the land grab in Alabama and Mississippi, and ultimately, I guess to some extent, maybe as a result of the Louisiana Purchase, does that fit into that paradigm that you alluded to earlier?
Yeah. Did it also result in sort of enhanced support among non-planter whites for the system of slavery? Yeah, I think it does. What happens politically in those states after 1815 and before the mid-1830s is pretty dramatic. It's a real ferment of white democracy and a lot of our basic concepts about how political parties work and how you participate in them and who's a real citizen and who's not. A lot of it comes from that place and that era, that frontier, as planter whites are trying to figure out how to maintain some kind of control of the economic arrangements there. And as non-planter whites are pushing them off, the more conservative planter whites off to the side and saying, you have to accept us as equals. That's not the only place that our basic ideas of a sort of a two-party democracy and so on come from. Stuff that was happening in New York State at the same time is also important. But it's a really key source of that, for sure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You've talked, I think, quite properly, emphasizing the agricultural slavery in the antebellum South. Could you say something about industrial slavery, such that it was like in the ironworks at Richmond and Selma, to the degree of efficiency and effectiveness of the slave system in such industrial enterprises?
Sure, sure. Yeah, there's been some economic study of the industrial slavery. You see, particularly in Virginia, is a big center of that in the 1850s, and there's some other places as well. And so, what the economists who studied have concluded is that on various different sorts of accounting models, slavery is an efficient use of capital in industrial production. But slave owners weren't always so eager to send their slaves off to Richmond to work in the factory, because those individuals had a depressing tendency to acquire cash and find a way to get out of slavery. And so sometimes it was much better from the enslaver's point of view to grab that individual and march them over to the slave trader's office and realize their value right then and there. So, yeah, that's industrial slavery, and there's a question about whether or not enslaved people could have been used in industry on a large scale if, let's say, cotton production had ever become less of a revenue earner.
Thank you, Dr. Baptist, for your remarks. I'm a graduate student in history focusing on embodiment and 19th century enslavement, so it was a special treat to hear you speak today. I was wondering what draws you to the metaphor, the zombie metaphor specifically. I understand that it's source-based and that there's this anxiety of African Americana moving towards this half-dead state as referenced by someone like Charles Ball. But I'm wondering, how do you sort of reconcile that metaphor with a more active move towards survival? The things that we all know about, the creativity and resistance that we see with breaking tools, playing dumb, slowing down work. If you could just speak more to those tensions or any that you might see, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks. I came to it not just from reading the Ellison essay, but also, and I think more powerfully, from what emerged from the sources themselves. Places where formerly enslaved people talked about the trauma of separation from family and movement to a new place under such horrific conditions. And the way that they talked about that experience, and sometimes they sort of ran it through a religious set of pipes, if you will. I think they ran it through a religious set of ways of thinking about their experience and processing their experience, and sometimes they didn't. But they talked about that experience in terms that were essentially terms of death. And then they had to either resurrect themselves, sometimes with the help of their friends and companions, and sometimes on their own. And I wanted to really honor that struggle, because I think one of the dangers when we talk about things like breaking tools and everyday resistance, and I do talk about that, and that's very important, but I think one of the dangers, if we start talking about that, or if we emphasize that too heavily, is that we don't honor the process that people had to go through in order to survive. We need to have a balance between the trauma and the survival, between the resistance and the difficulty of resistance, in order to really see how important the resistance is. And so, as a writer, I was seeking to balance those things in a way that evoked the sources.
Hi, thank you for a terrific talk. I actually work in energy policy, and so the story I think of when I think of the Industrial Revolution is an improvement in energy efficiency, moving from water to coal and ultimately oil. And I wonder if in your book or your other work, you look at how that might be intertwined in driving the expansion of slavery, or how the expansion of slavery was driving that need to find ways to power more factories, or how those were interrelated at all.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and coal starts to get used on a large scale to power factory equipment relatively late in the Industrial Revolution. So 1830s, 1840s in the U.S. is when you really start to see that happen. So the Industrial Revolution has already started, but it's certainly, I think it's true that, you know, just as without fiber, the Industrial Revolution was potentially stuck in a resource cul-de-sac. Without coal and fossil fuels, certainly that would have happened as well. So whether or not we would have got to the point where we could use coal on a large scale to power factories without cotton, I'm not sure. But in order to move further up that road of industrialization, human societies seem to have had to rely on fossil fuel. I don't know of an alternative with the 19th century technology.
Ed, I'm afraid we're out of time.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Folks, don't forget there's a book signing one level up at the Archives bookstore. We'll see you in just a few minutes.